be algorithmically why it got shoved in my face so rapidly, because every viewpoint is something that appears in my feed, as opposed to if you only follow one of those people, maybe it's been a little more at distance. But effectively, around World First time, people start to form what the Final Fantasy XIV term calls statics. Because we only get a raid every 8 months, they can actually form and break apart and reform, and they might be the same people every tier. It might be new people every tier. It's a little more flexible than something like World of Warcraft, where you maintain that kind of rating stability for so long because it takes so long to get to best in slot. So there is this idea that you're almost like with this guild constantly progressing and preparing, and it has a life cycle to it. But like in 14, I see groups break apart a lot, especially because a lot of these top raiders, to get around the weekly lockout so that they could gear maybe a tank and a healer at the same pace, they have multiple characters. And now at Data Center Visit and World Visit, that means that it's very, very easy to, like some people, be part of multiple raid groups across your alts. And there are kind of, in my opinion, 3 tiers of people that take part in Savage. So the first tier that we see are the World Firsters. They are taking this on at basically the minimum item level. It's not actually minimum item level. Minimum item level is often much lower than what they are. So when we go back and do that stuff later at minimum item level, like, how do they do this? Well, they didn't. We usually go in a couple levels above, thanks to things like crafted and pentamelding and all that, but it gets a little weird, especially back when Savage was released on day 1. They might go into those first fights basically in whatever they got while their crafters work on building up a set. And so they are taking this on without gear, without strategies, and all of that. The second tier are people that don't really have the time to sit around and slam their face into a wall 12, 15,000 hours a day. And so they come in and they do play week 1 and they get their first couple fights cleared, but they only get so far. And that means that when a weekly reset occurs, they're able to get access to even more Savage loot as a group. And then they can progress a little further, which tends to make things like a final fight DPS check or something like that just a touch easier for them. And by then, hopefully some of the guides have come out, and so they tend to have access to a little more information if they want it. And these are very top-end raiders. As a matter of fact, the second tier is where you see a lot of these pink parses. When you see these orange and pink top-level parses, those, like, being really good at executing a fight is not always the same as being really good at finding a fight out. Those are kind of 2 different skill sets. Some people possess both. And that's that second tier of raider, and they will raid all through the patch. But they're not interested in that kind of world first, like week 1, I want to put 50 hours in right away, which I think the fight usually falls faster than that, but still. Then there is the next tier down, and that's where I'd put everybody who clears Savage. And so they wait some number of weeks, might be 1, might be 8, and then they hop in. The guides are out there. There are people that are shot calling for them. They're running with people who have cleared it 1 or more times, have gear from it already. And so the longer you wait in that last group, the easier it gets. That's the group that I've been in, if I do Savage at all. And so this group kind of formed. And the question is, like, well, which of those 3 kind of tiers are you aiming for? And so a lot of this seems to be the gap between expectation and reality. So this has all been a lot of setup to explain that basically what happened is, as they progged, the group was not clearing the tier as quickly as they had hoped, and it became clear at a certain point that they were not going to get a week 1 clear. And not everybody in the group seemed to have the same number of hours to commit. Maybe you said, hey, I'll commit a lot for the first 3 or 4 days. We'll have it clear by then. And then when you don't, what do? Some people go, okay, I'll clear my schedule for tomorrow. And other people go, sorry, I told you I would give you unlimited time until X time, and then I'm out. Just because I'm out of time, I have other commitments.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to be that's where a lot of the frustration. So there's a lot of clips circulating around this group where emotions run high. But when you're clipping dozens of hours of prog and you go find 30 seconds of somebody's like, hey guys, like, we've died this a bunch of times. You guys are joking around. Can you focus for a second? Like, you can get those moments where we've all said something that was a little more passive aggressive or hateful than we intended. And that just tensions run high. And so those clips are, of course, circulating of this group that's kind of struggling. And then it becomes clear that they're not going to get a week 1 clear. And obviously they all wanted a week 1 clear.
Right.
But some people in that group are known for making guides in the community, are known for whether or not you like their guides. And they are known for having that kind of week 1 clear and pushing through that. They have other content to get to. They cover a lot of content in this game. They have other content to get to. That person happened to have gotten a lot of the gear from the early fights. I think they funneled all the gear to that person, because the way what you usually do is you funnel all the gear to like your top DPS or something like that. There's a logic to it. It's not something that affects Brian or I. And so there was a lot of gear funneled there. And that person said, cool, I'm going to go get my week 1 clear with another group. My understanding is that person still intended to prog the tier with that group otherwise, but just like, obviously we're not getting a week 1 thing, and like letting that chest fall, that's just one less chest I have. So like, I need to go get that chest. So let me go see if I can find a group that has cleared, that is missing a DPS spot, and I can slide in with their alts for their week 1 clear, with the intention of coming back, is my understanding. And there has been a whole bunch of frustration around like, is that betrayal? And who's at fault here? And so like, each community in general, it feels like that person's core community is like, ignore the haters, you're good, I got you. But maybe feelings towards creators they already disliked are always like, well, I never liked them anyway. And this is one of those like, I knew 5 years ago when I heard of them that they would make this decision today, and I pre-hated them for 5 years. And so you see some of that, but somewhere in between, there is some like, here's what I don't like about the situation, or here's why I think it's. But publicly, at least, everything I've seen from the content creators involved, because they're the more public faces, I don't think everybody in the group's a content creator, has been, it's not as big of a deal. Like, obviously, do I wish things had turned out differently? Of course. If we'd gotten a clear, none of this would have been an issue.
Yeah.
But I think it's fine. Like, it seems like they still intend to raid together. They're just struggling with the gap between what they all expected from week 1 and what the reality became. And there is a question of like, is everybody in that group the same level of effort or commitment to getting that week 1 clear?
Beyond the effort and commitment, though, like, you also get a couple points that we need to kind of break out. One is, not everybody in that group also is a content creator, and thus taking that dedicated time is them taking time off work, where the content creator, that's a part of their job. And so there's automatically, no matter how you split it, that difference. So like, when I go to play the content, I'm a content creator, but I take time off of work to go and do that, to kind of have that speed. The other side of it is actually like, we don't need to name names, but y'all can figure it out. The like, talking with them like directly, it's like, knowing speed is of the importance when it comes to guides. Everybody can sit here and say like, oh, I'll wait for their guide, etc. But when you just go look at the numbers, when you take out the emotion and the people who are there going to support you no matter what, the vast majority where that money, where you get paid as a part of your job, comes from, they just want whatever's first. And we've seen, you and I've talked about, even in videos directly, like how the Reddit community has decided the perfect way that guides should be made and rolled out. But there's not a financial backing to it. And you could say, well, there should be, or like, there's a problem, you should do this out of passion. That's a topic for it in and of itself. But you look like you want to chime in. Go ahead.
I think the first of a type of guide, right? And so like, people will wait for a June Bob guide, because Hector and June Bob are like the two biggest that I see that show up in my feed. I mean, the algorithm may be hiding other people from me that do the animated guides. And so people might be willing to wait a little longer for the animated guides. People may also be willing to wait a little longer for the first round of optimized guides. So like, everybody might have a certain amount of time they're willing to wait, but they want the first of that level of guide.
Right.
If the perfect guide could be animated beautifully and have the optimal strat on day 1, nobody else's guides would matter.
Right.
And so they come out at varying stages. Some people just want that day 1 guide. I'm just about to step foot in. I just want to be less than totally blind.
Right.
Like, and so different creators have built communities and have built their reputation around being part of a certain part of that wave of information. And so I have to imagine that when you run into something like a P8S wall, that is very frustrating for that creator, who's probably getting pinged. How much longer on that guide? When do you think you're gonna have that guide out? And they're like, trust me, man, I'd love to be working on the guide and laughing at how much gear I got. Chad has also chimed in and said there was a family emergency within it. And so like, these things happen, like having a group. It's really hard to commit to this. And that's part of raiding. Any of you that ever raided in WoW back when it was 40, people thought you were a complete jerk if you had no tolerance. But the raid group that I raided way back in like a little bit of vanilla, but mostly Burning Crusade, there was no tolerance, 0. Like, Brian had a sick kid one week. The next week he was benched, and people were like, you guys are such dicks. That's because at that many people, the number of excuses that are also Venn diagrammed with excuse and good excuse They're all good excuses. Oh, my car broke down. Great. I'm not even accusing you of lying. But what I am saying is there were 24 other people whose car didn't break down, and we all just sat around and so the group that I ran with was particularly not tolerant. And they're like, I don't know what to tell you. You should have been home an hour earlier, because then if your car had broken down, you would have known, and you could have gotten a ride, and you would have still been here on time. Like, and it sounds awful, but it's just, we have 24 people who did everything right that are now effectively with their car broken down because of yours. And so with 8, there's less of a chance of that. But it still can be wildly frustrating when you're like, I can both empathize with you that you had a family emergency. That's awful. It's something I wouldn't, I hope we all never experience again. But also, like, there's 7 other people who still want, their plans are still going forward as planned.
And even still, like, in terms of numbers, because we've seen MMOs like the MMORPG continue to get smaller and smaller in terms of its group size. Even, like, we would say our 24-man raids in 14 are substantially easier, and people are like, oh, we want a difficult version of that. And sure, there are some people who do. I'm actually in that category of wanting kind of a difficult 24-man version. I think that'd be interesting to see, but that does require a lot more on people. And Chris and I, like, back especially in ARR and even in Heaven's Word, like, we've tried multiple. We were really, back in that day, like, that's before I was super busy with all the kids. Like, it was like, yeah, let's do this. And we always felt like we had the curse of 7. Like, we could always get 7 people to show up ready to play and looking forward to it. And we'd always have to go to Party Finder to pick up the last person. And that meant we got maybe 2 pulls or maybe 3 pulls. Even if it was a learning party, like, that person would always be like, I'm out, and it was like, okay, now we got to relearn this with the new random, as opposed to, like, if we're trying to learn this together. So there is also just part of the difficulty isn't even in the content. And Aegea says it doesn't help that the Savage is a huge step up. Yoshi P actually said that he pre-warned everybody, like, they felt like everybody was easing into their rotations and the structure of this, that it was going to be a step up, and most likely the next tier another step up in terms of that, because that's just kind of how I think it's just supposed to be structured. So, like, there is that extra adage that this is feeling it. Now, that's actually what I was wanting to see. One of my comments was like, I felt like the 8 circle on normal, I was like, that just fell over for us. I've done it a couple times, and we've never wiped once on match made randoms. I'm sure that will happen, but I was just like, oh, okay, that was easier than expected. I thought the tree boss was the wall, like, at least on normal, for the most challenging piece. But then I was like, okay. But then I was like, I'm wondering to see how it is on Savage, and clearly it is a beast.
That wall, the DPS wall on it, if nothing else, seems to be a problem. So there are groups that even make it to Enrage, and they're just struggling. Which gear will fix that? Like, time will fix that. But like, it's very frustrating to not get that last chest this week, and then it resets. And how many weeks does it take your group? People who only raid 1 or 2 nights a week, that's not just one lockout they potentially miss. It could be multiple lockouts, because then they're going to re-clear the first 3, and that may take up most of their first raid night. And then their second raid night is still pushing down that wall. So it's hard. Emotions ran high. And so I think a lot of people have been ready to kind of decide who was the jerk here. But it just seems like there was a series of situations that everybody would have preferred not happen. And so everybody's deciding how to deal with that on their own. And it's really just an example of, when we got a chance to guest on Josh Strife Hayes' video, and he asked me, like, what's the definition of an MMO? Like, ironically to me, the number of people really doesn't take that many. It only takes, in this game, really 2 or 3 out of a total of 7 to pretty much ruin your experience. Like, you can see here, like, it has nothing to do with 25 million.
Right.
It's those other 7. They're defining your experience. When you're in an 8-man static, or when you're in a 30-man free company or something like that, they define your experience. And so for the fact that we call this MMO, there's a lot of tensions that have run really high out of 8 people. Like, that's what drives MMOs. It's this interaction. I think that's what this situation highlights. I don't know that there's really anything about any one of these people that was really anything that I'm like, oh my gosh, that totally, it's a reminder, like, this is something that's happening every day. Every week there is a static going through this. The difference is that static's not public. This one was really, really public. And so we're getting a chance to see what it looks like for anybody that hasn't listened to Preach's Drama Time or something like that and doesn't get a chance. And they're like, oh, I assume 8 people are just buddies and they just get along and push through a tier together. No, like at some point, somebody's going to get tired of the fact that like Brian's been hit by the same mechanic for an hour, and we're all just dying, and everybody else is doing everything fine, and they might have mistakes later in the fight, but they're all getting to this point fine, and Brian can't just get out of the one. What's the problem? And then it's like, oh, and then Chris has got to go again because his dog has a bladder problem or whatever, and it's like, I get that you can't control that, but like we're all just sitting around 5 minutes between every pool while Chris takes his dog out, and like next thing you know, they're like, wow, between Chris and Brian, we wasted 5 hours tonight. And like that's where the frustration comes from. It had nothing to do with the mechanics.
So I want to kind of talk a little bit now about the business of rating, because I've seen a lot of people discount in the idea of, and this comes into content creators. You'll get that online. People are like, oh, you should just be a fan and shouldn't make any money. But yet here's a third party, like just literally like, here's a check. Thanks for making whatever. And you're like, oh, okay. Like, I mean, I never have seen it to be enough to be like, we're not Ninja. We're not like getting the $1 million checks, but like there are MMO creators. Asmongold is like a classic example of probably one of the guys, and maybe Josh Strife, in terms of numbers that are just like, oh, that's great. Those are some really great numbers. Like that's amazing. But like outside of the one percenters of the one percenters here, there's also the business of rating, not just in terms of content creation. We talked about it in terms of guides and content. That's one aspect, but there's also a business of helping and selling clears within the rating community, not just in 14. This has been something that's across the board, and it's in-game money or real money. And it's like, however it's structured, like everybody knows it exists. Like it literally is like, this is a market that exists. And some of these individuals, they can do well. It's not like you're, not writing home to tell mom that, I'm buying her a house money, but it's, like there is an economy here as well. And one of the things I tend to see people like try to just like categorize some of this stuff, like it's just a game. It's just a game. For some people it is. And for some people, this is that, like being able to be the best and maybe even make a little bit of money on the side to help other people do this content. Like
even if it's just skill.
Even if it's just skill. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on essentially the economy and essentially the business of hard-end content within these kind of games?
I mean, I think if nothing else, there's pride being exchanged. There's some people that just want the clears. They're keeping all of it for themselves. They're not necessarily, they're going and joining Party Finder and stuff like that. They just like the act of having that information and then getting to share that information. That's a whole process, right?
Yeah.
And so like there are people that just thrive on that. And so anybody that's getting in the way of them getting to the part of the game they enjoy, just imagine that with anything else. Imagine if you couldn't continue to the next MSQ quest until I finished mine and I was standing in front of you with my /busy signal on, just sitting there. And you're like, I just want to get to the next quest. So like there are people that this is their end game. And so anybody that gets in the way of that is actively taking away from their Final Fantasy experience. So like, I don't really worry too much about the actual like business side of it. I mean, from a content creation side, like I think there are creators who are really knowledgeable about the game. I think you and I are across a wide number of subjects are fairly knowledgeable. So our total body of knowledge is pretty large. There are creators that are just really, really entertaining, right? Like I could watch Jesse Cox assemble IKEA. Like it would just be enjoyable.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you and I quite bring that to the table, that level of just raw entertainment. I think somebody like Pint does that, where like literally he just like pulls out a keyboard and he's good at keyboard, and I'm like, of course he is. Like he's good at everything he does. I bet that guy can play an ocarina. Like it's just ridiculous how talented he is. And then you see creators who are just really, really good at the game. And they may not have any chat engagement, they may not share their knowledge, but it's just fun to watch them play because they're doing things you and I can't do.
Yeah.
Like it's incredible what they do. And that's where you think of these like 360 no scope type moments in whatever game it is, where it's just incredible to watch them play. And when you see creators where you talk about that 1% of the 1%, those are people who have not just one of those categories, like I think you and I do, but two or maybe even all three.
Yeah.
Where they truly are knowledgeable, they're fun to watch, and while they're doing it, they are attaining a level of play that just most people will never hit.
Yeah.
And so I think within that kind of business side of it, the content creation side, like I really think that this can't be your only plan. Like, especially in 14, we get a raid every 8 months. So whether you're doing it for Gil or you're breaking terms of service and you're doing it for more than Gil, or you're a content creator like Todd, and like this is right, and teaching this content is important, and so he needs to know it through and through. And his willingness to flex to Dark Knight or whatever it needs to happen, like that's all part of his learning curve, because teaching it for the next 8 months is going to be what he does. I wouldn't worry about that's their thing to sort out what that looks like, depending on how many hours they stream or whatever. That's their thing to decide what makes it worth it for them. What I do think is at play here is just the element of like, this is some of the only content that one person can actively take it away from somebody else. Right. MSQ, it'd be hard to ruin my experience, especially if I'm willing to take it offline where you can't type a spoiler or something to me. It's mine. I own it. And within normal clears, like you said, I can jump in with any set of randoms. We're going to get our clears. So as long as I'm doing normal content across the board, but as we look down the barrel at Criterion Savage, anybody who did Delibram Savage, anybody who's done Savage or some of these extremes, EX4 punches pretty hard, or Ultimates, it only takes one person to actively bar you from that content. I don't care if this game has 25 million players. It takes one person to just actively stand in your way, and it's not easy always to just be like, we'll just swap that one person. That's not always that easy. Like, especially if they're friends with the other people in the group or whatever, like sometimes you're just there stuck dealing with that. So I think that's the side of it that I think is more at play here, is this really shows that the business tensions put that added pressure on it. But I think it's the fact that whether you're doing it for true, like, technical definition of business, like the act of making money, either in game or out, or you're just doing it for the act of acquiring entertainment, it is something that can be taken away by somebody else maybe coming in with a different skill level or a different set of intentions.
The expectations, like you hit the nail on the head with that, and I see even chat jumping in and absolutely agreeing with you on that. It's that, and it ends up coming down into, like, if you and I were going to sit down and we were going to take something like this seriously, which you have stepped into, you're doing some EX. I actually I'm leveling up Dancer tonight on stream, and then tomorrow going to be doing normal raids, and maybe I'll start stepping into the EX stuff, and maybe even the Savage stuff. Like, it's always been interesting to me. I've always run into I don't want to let other people down because I don't have that ability. Like, I know that about me, thank goodness. So I know not to sit here and ask you guys to have to work around my schedule. At some point, I think my schedule will open up a little bit, and that just is going to be a function of time, and that's fine. Like, I had time in the past. That's when I would do this kind of stuff. I assume I'll have time in the future to do these kind of things. But when it comes down to the expectations and the alignments of that, I think it ends up being that's where the frustration comes into play with the difficulty. And then you're talking about hours and hours and hours. Like, go work 12-hour shifts 5 days a week and tell me you're the best person to hang out with on the weekend. Probably not. Like, it's like we all have those limitations, and it's something that is then experienced live. And the thing you said also that's I want to echo, like, deeply, is that we can all take 30-second clips of our lives and make us look like saints or make us look like just the worst people on the planet. And it's important that, especially as people are like, oh, they're adults, right? Like, I've seen that kind of thing. Oh, they're adults. This is just a game. It's like, at the end of the day, like, that is, in my mind, I'm sitting here like, that's really presumptive. Like, try and take a step back and be like, oh yeah, like, imagine having all these shifts and then someone just telling you it's just a game. It's like, if it's important to you, like, okay, cool. Like, I'm not gonna pretend like that it has the same level of importance for me. But, like, don't come into my house and be like, you didn't, I can't believe you have dishes in the sink. Like, maybe it's important to me. Maybe it's not. If it is, it's my thing to deal with. And thank God I don't refill myself 24/7, 365. Just back in the old Justice TV days, like, what a mistake that was. I don't know.